On the surface, Mindy Dodd and her husband Henry seemed like a normal, hard-working, blue-collar couple.
She worked at Walmart in customer service.
Mr. Dodd had a painting and wallpaper business.
But in truth, their marriage was anything but typical.
The relationships were very intertwined.
Although it would take a mysterious disappearance.
He never showed up.
She was crying, saying that Daddy never came home.
And a brutal murder.
I think he's dead.
To reveal just how depraved their marriage really was.
There was a lot of inappropriate sexual conduct going on.
He got turned on. The thought of me being turned on.
That's disgusting. It's just sick.
So sick, in fact, that the authorities would find themselves wondering, even if Mindy was guilty of murder, would anyone blame her?
Do you feel good? In a way, yes, I did.
Smyrna, Tennessee, December 31st, 1999. It was mid-afternoon on New Year's Eve in this working-class suburb, a half-hour southeast of Nashville.
It's a very quiet community. It has a reputation of a very peaceful place to live.
But then, at a little after 3 o'clock, a frantic call came into the local 911 center.
My dad, I need a police officer at Arizona parking lot in Smyrna.
Okay, what's going on, sir?
My dad's playing in his truck.
And he wasn't sleeping.
He's been shot or something.
Do you see any gun or any kind of weapon in the truck?
No, he's been over to blood.
The man in the truck was 47-year-old Henry Sherman Dodd.
He's been missing. He left last night to go pick up my cousin at Hardy. And never came back.
His son had been looking for him.
But he had found his father far too late to help him.
You need an ambulance?
No, I think he's dead.
Just how Henry had ended up dead in his pickup truck, his son had no idea. At least that's what he told the dispatcher.
He noticed Mr. Dodd's truck in the middle of the parking lot. He stopped to investigate it and saw that Mr. Dodd was slumped over in the vehicle, at which point he called 911.
Although when prompted by the dispatcher, the caller did suggest one possibility.
Has he been depressed or anything?
Well, him and his wife been having problems.
What's his wife's name?
Mindy died.
And the troubles between Mindy and her husband were only the beginning. The investigation would uncover a shocking family history and disturbing allegations about what was going on inside the Dodd's home. Born in 1967, Mindy Sue Drury grew up in Hendersonville, Tennessee.
Mindy's dad, he was a mechanic. He worked at a gas station, and I was a stay-at-home mom.
And for the first few years of her life, Mindy was a happy, carefree child.
She stayed outside all the time, her and some neighbor girls, and they'd play outside and everything.
But soon after Mindy started elementary school, her life took a dramatic turn. Her parents divorced, and her mother went from a stay-at-home mom to a struggling single one.
I went to work after I left my first husband.
Mindy's mother wouldn't be single for long, though. When Mindy was 6, her mother met a man named Henry Sherman Dodd. Betty met Henry when she took a late-night waitressing job at a Nashville restaurant.
It used to be called the Pancake House, and they had a lounge upstairs, and it was the upstairs lounge. The restaurant was open 24 hours a day.
And once they met, it wasn't long before the charming Henry had convinced Betty to go out with him.
He could talk and make you believe he was the President of the United States.
The truth was a little more humble, though.
Mr. Dodd had a painting and wallpaper business.
Which meant that after they got married in 1974, Betty Dodd kept her waitressing job in order to get by.
To keep from having to pay a babysitter, he worked during the day and I worked at night.
It wasn't an easy life, but it appeared to work.
Everybody thought of him as, like a really good man, helping people That's what they know him for.
And the fact that he and Betty soon had a son of their own didn't stop him from being especially devoted to Mindy.
I just thought he was a loving, devoted stepfather.
And by the time she was in high school, Mindy had grown into a bubbly, outgoing teen.
She was very friendly with everyone. She could make conversation with just about anybody, and she could talk about anything. She could just pop out with anything.
Including, at the end of 1985, 2 words no mother wants to hear from her teenage daughter. I'm pregnant.
I didn't know who Mindy had gotten pregnant with. She said it was some boy she met.
According to Mindy, the father was no longer in the picture, but she decided to keep the baby, giving birth to a little girl in July of 1986.
When Mindy was about 18, she had Angel.
Mindy had managed to finish high school before the baby was born, but she remained close to her mother and Henry. In fact, she continued to live with them for her daughter's sake.
Me and Mindy, we both took care of her, and we would fight over who was going to feed her and this and that.
And while Betty helped with the baby, Mindy helped pay the bills.
She was working at Kroger's in the bakery, decorating cakes.
The family needed the help, too. Almost 20 years after he married Mindy's mother, Henry was having a hard time finding painting jobs.
He said, I can't find one that pays me what I want. Half the time he would quit a job and sit at home.
Sometimes he did more than sit.
He drank, not all the time.
And by 1992, Betty and Henry's marriage was clearly in trouble.
I would not get any sleep because he would keep me awake all night, just arguing with me.
But then, just when Betty figured things couldn't get any worse, Henry landed the knockout blow. During a drunken argument, he let slip a devastating secret. Mindy's little girl, Betty's granddaughter, was his.
I was shocked. I was beyond hurt.
And then Henry told Betty that he was in love with Mindy, now 25.
Didn't faze me. I was so numb.
Numb or not, Betty and Henry divorced, but she initially remained close to her daughter and her ex-husband.
We lived in the same apartments. I lived upstairs. They lived downstairs.
And in 1993, Mindy and Henry got married, despite a 15-year difference in their ages and the very unusual nature of their relationship.
The family dynamic is really odd here. Before Mindy and Mr. Dodd were married, Mr. Dodd was actually Mindy's stepfather.
His stepdaughter, in essence, became his wife.
Soon after the wedding, Mindy gave birth to a son, but the family didn't exactly settle down.
We lived in Cottontown first in a trailer, and then we moved to Hendersonville.
He was forever moving because he would get behind in the rent.
As always, Mindy helped out when she could, working a series of part-time jobs.
She worked at McDonald's as a swing manager, and then after that, she worked at Walmart in customer service.
But the family really didn't get on its feet until the late 90s, when Mindy, Henry, and the kids moved to Smyrna.
When the Dodd family arrived in Smyrna, it was just taking off. It's gone from about 10,000 people to about 40,000 people, also gone from quite a bit of a small town to a big suburb.
And Henry ended up painting quite a few of those new houses.
There was always houses that he painted, the new subdivisions, and he would get contracts with the builders.
In fact, Henry's painting business was doing so well that the family was even able to rent a home of their own.
It was nice. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath.
It was kind of a quiet, really nice, quiet neighborhood.
It had taken almost 6 years to do it, but it looked as if Mindy and her husband had finally overcome their bizarre beginnings and settled into a quiet, respectable life together. On the surface, one that appeared no different from thousands of other hardworking families in Smyrna.
It's very conservative. It is in the Bible Belt.
But something was about to happen that would expose all the couple's unsavory secrets, and then some. On December 31st, Henry Sherman Dodd suddenly disappeared. Mindy's daughter, then 13, says she was at a friend's house when she got a call from her mother at around 1 o'clock that afternoon.
She's crying, saying that Daddy never came home.
Mindy told her daughter to come home, and then she called the police.
My husband never came home last night.
Mindy told the dispatcher she'd last seen Henry the night before, shortly before she left for the graveyard shift at Walmart.
He left to go pick my nephew up at work, and he never showed up there.
And according to Mindy, she had no idea where her husband had gone.
He still wasn't home when I got home. Okay. Did you file a report yet? No, ma'am, that's what I'm calling to do. Okay. I'm just kind of worried. Okay. It's not like him to do that.
It was New Year's Eve, 1999, in the quiet Nashville suburb of Smyrna, Tennessee. And 32-year-old Mindy Dodd was looking for her husband, Henry Sherman Dodd. The 47-year-old house painter had disappeared the night before.
Her reports were that she had not heard from him since 11 o'clock, December 30th.
But then, just a few hours after Mindy called the authorities, Henry's adult son had also called 911 and reported that he'd just spotted his father's truck in a shopping center parking lot while driving to the bank.
He stopped to investigate it and saw that Mr. Dodd was slumped over in the vehicle, at which point he called 911.
You need an ambulance?
No, I think he's dead.
And when officers arrived on the scene, they confirmed it.
Mr. Dodd had, in fact, been shot to death.
But who would want to kill Henry, and why? When he called 911, Henry's son did say there was some sort of trouble between his father and his wife, Mindy.
Him and his wife have a problem.
Just what sort of problems Henry's son hadn't said. And before they could ask him to elaborate, another player entered the picture, James Smallwood.
Mr. Smallwood actually showed up to the crime scene.
James was Henry's nephew.
He had been living with him off and on.
The down-on-his-luck 23-year-old had moved in with the family 3 months earlier.
He used my father for a place to live.
Not that Henry was one to be taken advantage of easily.
Mr. Dodd expected him to work, was wanting him to pay his own way.
He was helping his uncle paint and wallpaper and everything.
And like Mindy, James also brought in a little extra money with a part-time job.
He was working at the Hardee's restaurant there in Smyrna.
In fact, according to what Mindy told the police when she reported her husband missing, that's where Henry had been going when he disappeared.
She conveyed how he was supposed to pick up Mr. Smallwood at Hardee's that night from work, didn't pick him up, that she then went and picked him up and brought him home.
And now, only a few hours after Henry had failed to pick him up, James had suddenly showed up at the location where his uncle had been found murdered.
The police became suspicious.
According to James, a friend had called him after spotting his uncle's truck and the police cars in the parking lot. However, once the officers at the scene informed James that his uncle was dead, he made what they felt was an odd request.
He wanted to make sure he was the one that would notify Mindy Dodd of the death.
That was most bizarre to us.
What's he need this task for?
Unsure just what to make of James's request, the investigators asked that he come back to the office with them so they could take his statement.
Once we got to the police department, of course, the family started showing up, and one of the family members that showed up was, of course, Mindy Dodd.
And once she arrived, the investigators asked to speak to her privately.
Because of the emotions of the situation, we wanted to separate her from the family.
But before the investigators ushered her into a back room, Mindy made an unusual request of her own.
Miss Dodd actually asked for Mr. Smallwood to accompany her.
And it didn't appear to be for emotional support.
Mr. Smallwood was very emotional. Miss Dodd was not emotional at all.
Mr. Smallwood, one that was crying quite a bit.
But why would James be so much more upset than Mindy? Unsure just what was going on, the police placed each of them in separate interview rooms, and then they questioned James first.
After the police became suspicious, they decided that it was a good time to conduct an interview.
In his interview, James started out by speaking very highly of Henry.
He's done more for me than anybody, man.
And you're talking about Mr. Dodd?
Yeah.
And when asked about Henry's disappearance, all James said he knew was that Henry was supposed to pick him up the night before.
I was working clothes.
But according to James, Henry had never showed, so he had called Mindy at work and begged her for a ride home.
She called out to go take me home.
What did she do afterward?
And she went back to work.
Next, the questions turned to Mindy and Henry's relationship, including the fact that Mindy had once been Henry's stepdaughter.
They're married?
Yeah.
But Mindy was his daughter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Used to be.
Okay, just want to make sure I got everything down pat here.
The backstory on the family was very unusual, just very intertwined. The relationships were very, very unusual relationships.
Although just how intertwined and unusual, the investigators had no idea. James told the investigators that after 7 years together, Mindy and Henry's relationship had grown stale.
Their marriage just was going downhill. They were staying together for the kids.
Although according to James, Henry had tried to spice things up sexually.
He persuaded me and Mindy into having a threesome with him.
There was basically a sexual triangle between the three of them.
Would he take pictures, video, or anything like that?
No, nothing like that. It was basically, just oral sex, and he liked to watch me do her.
And when the investigators asked whether Henry ever did more than watch,
did he ever touch you in any way?
James said yes.
Honestly, it really didn't faze me.
All three individuals would participate in whatever sexual game or event that they were having, whether it was between Mr. Smallwood and Mr. Dodd or between Mr. Smallwood and Miss Dodd.
And once James had explained the situation, the investigators figured they knew what happened.
Did you start enjoying the threesome with Mindy?
Yeah.
And according to James, Mindy felt the same way about him.
Did Mindy enjoy you and her relationship together?
Yeah.
Did she ever tell you she did?
Yeah.
Had the investigators uncovered a motive for murder?
Mr. Smallwood, I believe at the time, thought that he may be taking the place of her husband after he was gone.
There was one small complication, however. According to James, Mindy was also seeing someone else.
She apparently had a romantic involvement with a coworker at work.
All I know is that her and Robert have been having this thing going.
He had expressed a desire to marry her if she would leave her husband.
Do you think Robert had anything to do with this?
I don't know.
Or did he? By then, the investigators were convinced that James knew more about his uncle's death than he let on. And to nudge him into revealing more, they led him to believe that in the next interrogation room, Mindy was busy naming him as her husband's murderer.
Fingers being pointed at, okay, right now. And get to the being pointed at really, really sharp at.
Me?
It wasn't entirely untrue. The police were already talking to Mindy.
We, at the same time, doing just a very brief interview with Miss Dodd to try to get the timeline.
But James didn't know that was all the police were asking her, which gave them some useful leverage.
I want the truth. I don't want these more of these bullcrap lies, okay? I want to shoot you straight, okay?
Would the idea that Mindy was selling him out be enough to crack James?
But man, I got no proof.
Well, you need to tell me what's up.
I'll tell you what's up, and well, y'all at least get this on tape with her saying she had part of it.
James finally began crying and stated that he had killed Mr. Dodd.
He said then that Mindy Dodd asked him to do it.
Mindy was saying she's tired of it, she can't deal with it anymore.
And when James said yes, Mindy had put a plan in motion.
Mindy Dodd gave him the gun that was actually the victim's gun that had been kept in the closet.
Then, on the night of December 30th.
What happened that evening is Mr. Smallwood called Mr. Dodd to pick him up from the restaurant that he worked at. Mr. Dodd picks him up at the restaurant and they go back to their home.
And once they pulled into the driveway,
He just pulled the gun out and then shot Mr. Dodd.
I shot him in the head, and then I shot him in the chest.
James said that once he'd shot Henry, he slid the body over and slipped behind the wheel of his uncle's truck.
And started driving around Smyrna trying to think of a place to get rid of the body.
But there was one tiny complication. Henry wasn't dead.
I heard him, and he was gurgling, and I took the gun, and I just pop, 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 pop.
Mr. Smallwood again shot him a couple more times in the back.
Then, once Henry was definitely dead, James said he had parked the truck, tossed the keys and gun into a dumpster, and called Mindy.
Mindy's first statement to him was, "Is it done?" And that's where Smallwood responded, "Yes." And Mindy responds, "Finally."
On the evening of December 31st, 1999, police in Smyrna, Tennessee were investigating the murder of Mindy Dodd's husband, Henry Sherman Dodd. The 47-year-old painter had been found dead in his pickup truck earlier that afternoon.
It looked like somebody had actually drove him there and planted that scene or planted that truck there with him in it.
And by that evening, the authorities had identified that somebody, Henry's nephew, James Smallwood. The 23-year-old had just confessed to killing Henry at Mindy's request.
They decided the way to deal with their situation and end their problems with Mr. Dodd was to eliminate him.
And if James's statement was true, the situation he and Mindy were in was almost too disturbing to contemplate.
Mr. Dodd forced Mindy and Mr. Smallwood to engage in sexual acts with him and with each other.
And according to James, when Mindy had approached him about killing Henry, he had agreed to help.
It appeared that Smallwood may have had a crush on her.
Although considering James's statement that Mindy had also been sleeping with a coworker, the investigators wondered, did Mindy have similar feelings for James, or was she simply using him?
Everybody in the relationship was deceiving the other. Mr. Smallwood was thinking, I'm going to be the romantic person in the life of Mindy Dodd, while Mindy Dodd is thinking, I'm going to be involved with the coworker at Walmart.
Although no matter who ended up with Mindy, James's statement clearly implicated her as the mastermind behind her husband's murder.
So that's when we confronted Mindy Dodd.
Not that they came right out and asked whether she put James up to killing her husband. Instead, when the investigators stepped into the interrogation room, they led Mindy to believe that the interview was routine, simply for the purpose of gathering information.
I just need to start at the beginning. How were you notified about what had happened to them?
At first, Mindy denied knowing anything about the murder. All she knew was that Henry hadn't picked up James at work the night before.
About 12:30, I got a phone call, and it was James. He said, asked me, could I come pick him up? He said he tried to call the house, and there was no answer.
Miss Dodd had a very calm demeanor, not very much emotion, very talkative, almost in a sense where she was talking about everything except for the death of her husband of 6 years and the father of her children.
And when the investigators started asking Mindy about her and Henry's sex life, she was surprisingly nonchalant about that, too.
Okay, he had a problem of getting it, or keeping it that way. And so therefore, I really didn't want to do it that much, you know. And he also got turned on to the thought of me being with another man. Because he was my husband and I wanted to make my husband happy. I did some things that I'm not, you know, like, there's another guy.
But Mindy claimed Henry had eventually become jealous, despite the fact that it had been his idea to bring someone else into the relationship.
We got into a big argument that if he wasn't around, that I'd probably find somebody that I love and probably screw the hell out of him all the time.
And according to Mindy, Henry wasn't about to let that happen.
He threatened to kill me if he ever found out that I was with someone.
Mindy said she had taken her husband's threat seriously.
He threatened my life as far as I was concerned. I wanted to go to sleep about it. I was afraid to.
However, Mindy also said she hadn't kept her husband's threat entirely to herself.
I told James about it.
And how did James respond?
He got upset. He said nobody threatens anybody but Allah. He said, I hear about you and these kids. He's not going to threaten them. This is our children.
Mindy said she hadn't believed James.
James is the type of person. He says things, but he doesn't always hold to them.
And she certainly hadn't mentioned James's threat to her husband.
So I was afraid that he would kill James, or me, if I told him. I was afraid he would kill Lance. And I honestly believe that he would, if he knew.
In fact, Mindy said she had been so sure that James was bluffing that she had almost teased him about it when she called him at work on the evening of December 30th.
And I said, are you still going to go through with it? And he said, yes. And when I said go through with it, what were you talking about? He was talking about he was going to do it. I'll do that. He was going to do it.
Not that Mindy believed him, according to what she told the investigators.
Well, he's not going to do this, you know. He's just bluffing, blowing off at the mouth like he always does.
Sometimes people joke around about stuff they're not supposed to joke around with.
But as it turned out, James hadn't been joking.
How did you do that? He went in the closet and got it out. Did you tell him what was there? He knew he kept it in the closet.
Everybody in the family knew where that gun was. Everybody did. So, I mean, my mom didn't have to get the gun.
And according to Mindy, she had no idea he was really going to shoot Henry.
She really said she had nothing to do with it.
In fact, Mindy said she had been surprised when James called her up and asked her for a ride home after killing Henry and ditching his truck.
I said, oh my God.
And according to Mindy, she was still in shock when she picked James up a few minutes later.
I said, oh my God, you didn't. What he said? He started getting hysterical and said, I thought you wanted me to. I said, dude, I said, I just didn't think you would do it. Because I seriously didn't think you would do it.
Her only reason for saying that was, I didn't think he was serious.
Do you think that you had a part in your husband Mindy?
Honestly, I really had no control over it.
But if that was the case, why did she call the sheriff's department the next morning and report Henry missing, knowing full well that her husband was dead?
She had made so many false statements that she had no knowledge where he was at.
According to Mindy, it was simple. She had been afraid of James.
I was afraid if he did do that, I was afraid he was going to do the same thing to me.
The investigators weren't quite convinced, though. For one thing, Mindy still didn't seem all that broken up about her husband's death.
I don't remember Miss Dodd ever expressing remorse.
In fact, she admitted that, at least on some level, she'd had the opposite reaction to Henry's death.
Did you feel free?
In a way, yes.
Did you feel relieved?
But I was more special.
How do you feel now?
And unfortunately for Mindy, there was one more shock coming. At the end of her statement, the Smyrna police placed her under arrest for first-degree murder.
She basically confirmed what Mr. Smallwood said.
And since he had confessed to shooting Henry, the investigators also booked James for first-degree murder.
By midnight of that same day, both Mindy Dodd and James Smallwood had been arrested and placed in custody.
On September 25, 2001, Mindy Dodd stood trial for murder at the Rutherford County Courthouse in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The 34-year-old faced murder and conspiracy charges stemming from the December 1999 death of her husband, Henry Sherman Dodd, at the hands of his nephew, James Smallwood.
Mr. Smallwood said that he was asked to kill Mr. Dodd by Mindy Dodd.
James wasn't just Mindy's nephew by marriage, though. He was also her lover. part of a three-way relationship involving Mindy, James, and Henry.
There was a lot of inappropriate sexual conduct going on.
The details of which had caused quite a stir in Mindy's hometown of Smyrna.
Considering that we're in the Bible Belt, the facts of this case were going to be not just odd, but extremely odd.
But as sensational as those salacious details were, when it came time to deliver his opening statement, the prosecutor asked the jury to look beyond them to see the real issue at stake.
That the real point of the case was the fact that we had a murder conspiracy going on.
And the prosecutors had what they believed to be powerful evidence of that conspiracy, starting with James's videotaped confession.
The strongest piece of evidence against Mindy Dodd was James Smallwood.
She had part of it.
Not only had James confessed to shooting Henry, after his arrest, he'd led police to the murder weapon.
He told us where he had dumped that.
The gun, the ammunition and stuff. We sent detectives over there to that to locate those.
We definitely had more physical evidence to tie James Smallwood to what he had done and more circumstantial evidence as far as the Mindy Dodd side of it, but still at the same time, I feel we have an overwhelming great case.
Starting with testimony from the man who'd actually pulled the trigger, James Smallwood.
We agreed that as part of his plea agreement, he would plead to conspiracy to commit murder. He would have a sentence of life with parole.
Mindy, on the other hand, rejected all attempts to negotiate a plea.
Mindy rejected the plea bargain because it wasn't true and she wasn't going to say she done something that she didn't do.
In its opening statement, the defense stood by Mindy's claim of innocence, arguing that she had never intended for James to kill her husband.
This was something that Mr. Smallwood had done on his own.
And when the prosecution started laying out its case and called James to the stand, he certainly sounded as if he had plenty of reasons to want his uncle dead.
Mr. Smallwood had reported that he had been sexually abused early in his childhood by Mr. Dodd.
The whole family dynamic started coming out the more we got into court.
However, according to James, his long history of abuse by Henry wasn't the reason he killed his uncle.
What James Smallwood testified to at trial was that Mindy Dodd was the person who was behind this whole thing.
The prosecution really stressed that Mindy and James Smallwood talked about the murder before it happened.
James also testified that Mindy had provided him with the means to kill her husband.
She was the one who supplied the firearm.
And then, after her husband was dead,
she asked, "Is it done?" And he says yes. That was very important. And in her interview, she did acknowledge that she did call him.
I asked him, I said, "Is it done?"
What did you mean?
I meant, did he kill her? Because I didn't think he did.
Okay, what did he say?
He said, yes, it's done.
On cross, however, the defense questioned the accuracy of James's statement, starting with his claim that Mindy had given him her husband's gun.
The fact that Mindy knew that there was a gun in the closet doesn't necessarily mean that she gave the gun to James Smallwood.
And when it was the defense's turn to open their case, they started with Mindy's claim that she had never taken James's talk of killing Henry seriously.
In their opening statement, the defense said, yeah, Mindy and James Smallwood did talk about the murder from time to time. However, it really didn't matter because James was known as a blowhard.
And yet, as the defense pointed out to the jury, Mindy did have reason to want her husband dead.
There was lots of sexual abuse and perversion that the defense was alleging occurred in this family.
In fact, according to Mindy and her family, the three-ways between Mindy, James, and Henry were only the latest in a string of disturbing sexual acts that started back when she was a little girl. Mindy and Henry's relationship had always been unusual, to say the least.
Mr. Dodd had married Mindy's mother when Mindy was only 6 years old.
And according to Mindy, he'd begun sexually abusing her soon after.
She was claiming, sexual abuse as a young child.
And he continued abusing her until he finally impregnated her. It was after that time that Mr. Dodd divorced Mindy's mother and later married Mindy.
In order for her to survive that situation, it's just very adaptive for her to give in to what he tells her to do, because it's going to be much safer for her than what she perceives behaving otherwise might be.
And as James had just testified, Mindy wasn't the only minor he'd abused either.
After we were married, I found out later that he had molested some people in his family, and he had molested James.
And the defense claimed that the love triangle between Mindy, Henry, and James had been just as abusive.
While Mindy and James Smallwood did have a sexual relationship, it wasn't consensual. It was actually forced by Mr. Dodd.
The fact that Henry abused James from a very young age, it is likely that that made him very vulnerable for repeated abuse.
And Betty Dodd claimed that Henry had sexually abused her, too, even after their divorce and his marriage to Mindy.
I would go to visit my grandkids, and he would take me into the bedroom and then make me have sex with him.
And Henry hadn't stopped there, according to the defense. They claimed that he had forced Mindy and her mother to violate the ultimate taboo.
To engage in sexual acts with each other.
That was a shock to me, because that's disgusting. That's just sick.
Mindy's mother said they'd had no choice but to comply.
He physically threatened us, and I was so afraid of him because he was a lot bigger than me. He was 6 foot tall, and just his anger and the way he turned when he got angry, and he would punch holes in the walls.
He knew how to manipulate people, and he knew how to control them.
And according to the defense, all the bizarre and twisted abuse he'd subjected the family to over the years meant that Henry bore some responsibility for his own death.
The defense argued that Mr. Dodd had created a situation by which all of these people were just trying to find a way out.
It was just a horrible, horrible situation.
However, as horrible as her situation supposedly was, the defense stopped short of admitting that she had intended for James to kill Henry.
While he had abused her, she also, in some essence, loved him. So it didn't make sense that Mindy wanted to kill her husband.
I don't see my mom actually going through with something like that.
But now, on trial for murder, would Mindy be brave enough to take the stand in her own defense? Her attorneys decided not to risk it.
All the information was already out there. I mean, the only thing she could do was get deeper and deeper into that hole by testifying for herself.
Although even without Mindy telling the story firsthand, there was still a strong chance that the twisted tale of Henry's many perversions would affect the outcome.
The abuse, physical, mental, sexual, all manner of horrors that she suffered. And the jury certainly would have taken that into account as well.
But would they be enough to counter James's claim that she had masterminded her husband's murder?
I never doubted the fact that James Smallwood would be believed. I thought that he appeared very sincere. To be honest with you, he is, of the two, he is the one who expressed the most remorse.
On September 27, 2001, the jury in Mindy Dodd's murder trial announced it had reached a verdict. The 34-year-old mother of two was accused of orchestrating the plot to kill her husband, Henry Sherman Dodd. At trial, the dead man's nephew, 25-year-old James Smallwood, had testified that he had shot Henry at Mindy's request.
The trial boiled down to whether you believe that Mindy knew that James Smallwood was going to kill Mr. Dodd. If you believe that, you've got to convict her. If you don't believe that, then you have to find her innocent.
And when the verdict was read, there was no doubt which version of the story the jury had believed.
Mindy Dodd was found guilty. She was found guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. She was also found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder.
Given Mr. Smallwood's testimony and the evidence that was presented, and in the manner in which it was presented, I did not think the jury's verdict was shocking at all. It was almost a foregone conclusion.
The murder conviction earned her a life sentence with the possibility of parole.
Before she's eligible for parole, she will have to serve 51 calendar years.
Mindy's family was stunned by the outcome of the case.
I cried my eyes out, and I took it very hard. I believe that she is innocent.
I was so mad. It just hurt so bad for her to have to go to jail on something that he done and that she's not guilty of. It just hurt so bad.
According to Mindy's daughter, the hurt continues to this day.
It made me grow up really fast. I never really got to have that childhood. I've been without her for so long that I don't even know how to cry about it anymore.
And yet, while Mindy's mother remains convinced that her daughter is innocent, she also feels that in some ways, Mindy is in a better place.
I don't think my daughter should be in prison, but I think she's better off than she would have been staying with him.
On the morning of January 31st, 2018, a quiet stretch of road near the small Italian town of Pollenza became the center of a discovery so disturbing that it would soon capture the attention of an entire nation. The area was not known for violent crime. It was the kind of place where daily life moved at a steady pace, where passing vehicles were few, and where anything unusual immediately attracted notice. That morning seemed ordinary at first. There was nothing to suggest that within a matter of hours investigators would find themselves standing before one of the most shocking crime scenes Italy had witnessed in years. Near the roadside sat two abandoned suitcases. At first glance, they appeared unremarkable. Travelers lose luggage. People discard unwanted belongings. Objects left beside roads are rarely the beginning of a national tragedy. Yet something about the suitcases seemed wrong. Their placement raised questions. Why had they been left there? Who had brought them? And why would anyone abandon two large pieces of luggage in such an isolated location? Authorities were called. What followed would transform a local investigation into a case that dominated headlines across Italy and beyond. Inside the suitcases were human remains. The discovery immediately shifted the situation from a routine inquiry to a major homicide. Investigation. Officers arriving at the scene were confronted with evidence of extraordinary violence. The victim's body had been dismembered and concealed within the luggage. Even experienced investigators understood that they were facing a crime unlike most they would encounter in their careers. News of the discovery spread rapidly. For residents of the region, the revelation was almost impossible to comprehend. Crimes involving the concealment of human remains often provoke a particular kind of horror. They suggest not only violence, but also a deliberate effort to erase a person's identity, to hide what happened, and to prevent the truth from ever being known. The questions began immediately. Who was the victim? How had they died? Who was responsible? And perhaps most importantly, what sequence of events had led to such a devastating outcome? As investigators worked to identify the remains, a story slowly emerged. The victim was an 18-year-old woman named Pamela Mastropietro. Her age alone was enough to provoke public sympathy. 18 years old, an age associated with beginnings rather than endings. An age when most people are still imagining their future, still making plans, still trying to determine who they will become. Yet Pamela's story was more complicated than a simple portrait of youth interrupted. Before the public learned about the crime itself, they learned about the person at the center of it. Pamela had struggled with drug addiction during her teenage years. Like many young people facing substance dependency, her life had become marked by periods of treatment, attempts at recovery, setbacks, and renewed efforts to rebuild. By early 2018, she was staying at a rehabilitation facility near the city of Macerata. She was not alone in that struggle. Across Italy and throughout the world, countless young people confront similar challenges every day. recovery is rarely a straight path. It is often fragile, uncertain, and difficult. Then, on January 29th, 2018, Pamela left the rehabilitation center without authorization. At the time, no one could have known how significant that decision would become. 2 days later, her remains would be found inside suitcases abandoned near Pollenza. The gap between those two moments, between her departure from the rehabilitation center and the discovery of the suitcases, would become the central mystery investigators sought to solve. For law enforcement, every homicide investigation begins with a timeline. The final known movements of a victim often provide the framework upon which an entire case is built. Where was the victim last seen? Who interacted with them? What decisions did they make? What opportunities existed for intervention? And where does the available evidence lead? In Pamela's case, investigators would eventually determine that after leaving the rehabilitation facility, she traveled into the city of Macerata. According to the investigation, she went to the area around Diaz Park seeking heroin. There, she was believed to have encountered a man named Innocent Osgale, a Nigerian drug dealer with a criminal history related to narcotics offenses. After that encounter, Pamela disappeared. The simplicity of that statement conceals the gravity of what it means. People vanish every day for many reasons. Some leave voluntarily. Others lose contact with friends and family for brief periods. Yet in homicide investigations, there is often a final moment when a victim unknowingly crosses a threshold. A final conversation, a final meeting, a final decision. At the time, it appears ordinary. Only later does its significance become clear. For Pamela, investigators believe that meeting marked the beginning of the final chapter of her life. The horror of the case did not end with the discovery of her remains. As investigators gathered evidence, further details emerged that intensified public outrage. The circumstances surrounding her death, the condition of her body, and the allegations presented during legal proceedings would transform the case from a local tragedy into a national obsession. Every development generated new questions. Every court hearing attracted renewed attention. Every revelation seemed to deepen the sense of shock surrounding the crime. But before the verdicts, before the appeals, before the political debates that would eventually surround the case, there was a family searching for answers. True crime stories often focus on investigations, forensic evidence, and courtroom proceedings. Yet at the center of every case is a human being. A person whose absence creates a void that can never truly be filled. Behind every headline exists a family waiting for news, hoping for explanations, and struggling to understand how an ordinary day transformed into an unimaginable nightmare. For Pamela's loved ones, the discovery near Pollenza did not bring relief. It brought confirmation of the worst possible outcome. The young woman they knew was gone. The future she might have had was gone with her. And what remained was a growing list of questions. What happened after she left the rehabilitation center? What occurred during the final hours of her life? Why was her body concealed inside suitcases? Who was responsible? As investigators began assembling evidence, they faced the challenge of reconstructing events that no longer existed except through traces left behind. Physical evidence, forensic analysis, witness accounts, timelines. Each piece would become part of a larger puzzle. The investigation would eventually uncover blood-stained clothing, DNA evidence, and multiple connections leading toward a single apartment. Prosecutors would later argue that Pamela had not died from a drug overdose, as initially claimed by the accused, but from stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. They would further allege that her body was dismembered in an effort to conceal the crime. Yet, even as evidence accumulated, controversy followed. Questions concerning sexual violence would become the subject of prolonged legal disputes. Court proceedings would continue for years, Appeals would challenge aspects of the case. Public debate would intensify, and the crime itself would eventually spill beyond the boundaries of the courtroom, influencing wider discussions about immigration, drug crime, public safety, and the responsibilities of the media. Few criminal cases remain confined to the facts alone. Some become symbols. Some become political battlegrounds. Some become reflections of broader fears already present within society. The murder of Pamela Mastropietro would become all three. In the weeks and months following the discovery near Pollenza, newspapers, television programs, commentators, politicians, and ordinary citizens all attempted to interpret the meaning of the crime. Different groups saw different lessons. Different voices emphasized different aspects of the story. The result was a case that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Yet amid the arguments and headlines, one fact remained unchanged. An 18-year-old woman had lost her life. Everything else came afterward. As we begin this story, it is important to remember that distinction. The debates that followed would become significant. The court proceedings would become significant. The social consequences would become significant. But before any of that existed, there was simply Pamela Mastropietro, a young woman struggling with addiction, attempting to navigate a difficult period in her life, and unknowingly moving toward a fate that would shock an entire country. The two suitcases found near Pollenza were not merely evidence containers. They were the beginning of a question that investigators, prosecutors, journalists, and the public would spend years trying to answer. How did Pamela Mastropietro's life end there? To understand that answer, we must first understand who Pamela was, the challenges she faced, and the circumstances that brought her to Macerata in the final days of January 2018. That is where this story truly begins. Before a homicide becomes a criminal investigation, before it becomes a courtroom battle, and before it becomes a national headline, it begins with a person. In true crime stories, there is often a risk that the victim can gradually disappear behind the details of the offense. The crime itself becomes the focus. The evidence becomes the focus. The perpetrator becomes the focus. Yet every case starts with an individual whose life existed long before the events that would eventually define public memory. In the case of Pamela Mastropietro, understanding the crime means first understanding the young woman at its center. Not because her life explains what happened to her, but because her life mattered independently of the tragedy that followed. Pamela Mastropietro was born on August 23, 1999, in Rome, Italy. By the time she reached adulthood, she was only 18 years old. 18, an age suspended between adolescence and adulthood. Old enough to make independent choices, yet still young enough to be discovering what kind of future lay ahead. Like many people her age, she was living through a period of uncertainty. The difference was that Pamela's uncertainty was not limited to questions about education, work, relationships, or identity. She was also fighting a personal battle against drug addiction. Addiction has a way of altering the course of a life long before it destroys it. For young people especially, substance dependency often introduces instability into years that would otherwise be devoted to growth and development. Plans become interrupted. Relationships become strained. Opportunities become difficult to maintain. Recovery becomes an ongoing process rather than a single decision. Some individuals overcome addiction quickly. Others struggle for years. Most experience a complicated journey somewhere in between. According to the available information, Pamela faced significant challenges related to drug use during her teenage years. She participated in multiple rehabilitation programs. The fact that she entered treatment more than once reveals something important about the reality of addiction. Recovery is rarely a straight line. It often involves progress followed by setbacks, determination followed by relapse, hope followed by disappointment, and then renewed efforts to begin again. People looking from the outside sometimes misunderstand this process. There is a tendency to imagine recovery as a single turning point, a moment when someone decides to change and everything improves afterward. The truth is usually far more complicated. Treatment centers exist because recovery requires support, structure, and time. Even then, success is never guaranteed. Every day presents new challenges. Every decision can carry consequences. Every temptation becomes a test of resilience. By early 2018, Pamela was enrolled in a rehabilitation program near the city of Macerata. This detail is significant because it places her in a phase of life defined not by criminal activity or violence. She was receiving treatment. She was participating in a recovery process. Whatever difficulties she had experienced in the past, she was in an environment designed to help people move forward. The city of Macerata itself would later become inseparable from the story. Located in the Marche region of central Italy, Macerata is known for its history, culture, and relatively peaceful atmosphere. It is not a place that most people would associate with notorious crimes. Like countless medium-sized European cities, it balances modern life with traditions that stretch back centuries. Residents go to work, attend school, spend time with family, and move through routines that often remain unchanged for years. Yet even quiet cities are not immune to larger social problems. Drug trafficking, addiction, and substance abuse are not confined to major metropolitan areas. They exist in communities of every size. In Macerata, investigators would later focus on the local drug trade as a key element in understanding Pamela's final movements. As January 2018 drew to a close, nothing publicly suggested that a national tragedy was approaching. For Pamela, life remained centered on recovery. For those around her, the future likely appeared uncertain but not hopeless. Then came January 29th. The significance of that date would only become clear later. On January 29th, 2018, Pamela left the rehabilitation facility without authorization. The available facts do not provide a detailed explanation for why she chose to leave. What matters is that she did. At the time, such departures may not have seemed extraordinary. Rehabilitation centers frequently work with individuals facing powerful addictions. Some patients leave voluntarily. Some return later. Others struggle to remain committed to treatment. Within addiction recovery programs, moments of uncertainty are unfortunately common. What no one knew was that this departure would become the final confirmed chapter of Pamela's life. When investigators later reconstructed her movements, January 29th became the starting point of their timeline. Every major criminal investigation depends upon a chronology. Detectives seek to understand where a victim went, who they met, and what occurred during each stage of the final hours before death. Establishing a timeline allows investigators to narrow possibilities, identify suspects, and connect evidence. In Pamela's case, the timeline began with her departure from the rehabilitation center. According to the subsequent investigation, she traveled to an area near Diaz Park in Macerata. The reason investigators believed she went there was connected to heroin. For individuals battling addiction, relapse is often one of the most painful realities of recovery. The desire to stop using drugs can coexist with overwhelming cravings. Even after entering treatment, the temptation to return to substance use may remain powerful. The information available indicates that Pamela went to Diaz Park seeking heroin. This detail would later become central to understanding how she encountered the man prosecutors ultimately identified as responsible for her death. That man was Innocent Osgale. The facts available about him are limited but significant. He was a Nigerian national. He was involved in drug dealing. He had previous convictions related to narcotics offenses. According to investigators, Pamela and Osgale came into contact in the area around Diaz Park on January 29th. From the perspective of the future investigation, this meeting would become one of the most important moments in the entire case. At the time, however, it was simply one interaction among countless others occurring throughout the city that day. One of the unsettling realities of homicide investigations is that critical moments often appear ordinary while they are happening. A victim meets someone. A conversation occurs. A decision is made. A person enters a vehicle, a building, or a room. Nothing about the moment announces its importance. Only later, after tragedy strikes, do investigators and families recognize that a seemingly routine event marked the point where everything changed. For Pamela, the encounter identified by investigators would later assume exactly that significance. Afterward, she vanished. The word disappeared can sometimes sound abstract, but its consequences are deeply human. A disappearance means messages stop arriving. Phone calls go unanswered. People expecting contact receive silence instead. Time begins to stretch. Concern begins to grow. Questions multiply. At first, there is often uncertainty. Perhaps the person will return. Perhaps there is an explanation. Perhaps they simply need time. Then the hours pass. Then an entire day. Then another. And gradually hope begins to compete with fear. The available information tells us that after her encounter with Osgale, Pamela disappeared completely. Those missing hours would become the focus of investigators, prosecutors, journalists, and eventually the courts. What happened during that period? What decisions were made? What actions were taken? Those questions remained unanswered in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. For the moment, all anyone knew was that an 18-year-old woman had left a rehabilitation center and had not returned. Looking back, it is easy to view this period solely through the lens of what happened afterward. Yet, doing so risks overlooking something important. During these final known hours, Pamela was not yet a homicide victim. She was a young woman struggling with addiction, attempting to navigate challenges that many people face every day. Her story was still being written. The future had not yet been closed off. This distinction matters because true crime narratives can sometimes unintentionally reduce victims to the circumstances of their deaths. Pamela was more than a crime that later consumed headlines. She was more than a court case, more than a forensic investigation, more than a political controversy. She was a person whose life contained experiences, struggles, aspirations, and relationships that existed long before January 2018. The tragedy of her story lies not only in the violence that followed, but also in the possibilities that disappeared with her. As investigators would later discover, the events unfolding after January 29th were moving toward a devastating conclusion. Within 48 hours, 2 abandoned suitcases would be found near Pollenza. Within 48 hours, authorities would begin uncovering evidence that pointed toward one of Italy's most shocking criminal cases of the decade. Within 48 hours, the search for a missing young woman would become a homicide investigation. But at this stage of the story, none of that has happened yet. The public does not know Pamela's name. The media has not begun reporting. The courts have not heard evidence. The debates that will eventually divide public opinion have not started. There's only a young woman who left a rehabilitation facility, traveled into Macerata, and disappeared after an encounter that investigators would later place at the center of the case. The silence surrounding those missing hours is what makes this stage of the story so haunting. Because somewhere within that silence lies the answer to what happened next. And when investigators finally begin to uncover that answer, they will find themselves confronting a crime whose brutality will shock an entire nation and whose consequences will extend far beyond the boundaries of a single criminal case. That investigation begins with the final known movements of Pamela Mastropietro on January 29, 2018, the day she left the rehabilitation center and unknowingly entered the last chapter of her life. January 29, 2018, began as an ordinary winter day in central Italy. Nothing about the day would initially distinguish it from countless others. The streets of Macerata were carrying on with their usual rhythm. People were heading to work, attending classes, shopping, meeting friends, and moving through familiar routines. Life continued with the quiet predictability that characterizes most days before tragedy enters. For Pamela Mastropietro, however, that day would become the final confirmed day of her life. At 18 years old, Pamela was staying at a rehabilitation facility near Macerata. Her presence there reflected an ongoing struggle with drug addiction, a challenge that had already shaped much of her adolescence. Recovery is often described as a journey, but in reality, it can feel more like a series of battles fought one day at a time. Progress can be fragile. Determination can coexist with temptation. Even when a person sincerely wants to change, the pull of addiction can remain powerful. At some point on January 29th, Pamela left the rehabilitation center without authorization. The available facts do not reveal her precise thoughts or motivations in that moment. We do not know what she was feeling as she left. We do not know whether she believed she would return later that day. We do not know whether she viewed her departure as temporary or permanent. What we do know is that once she walked away from the facility, she entered the final known chapter of her life. For investigators who would later reconstruct the case, this departure became the first firmly established point in the timeline. Every homicide investigation begins with a sequence of movements. Where was the victim? Who saw them? Who interacted with them? What happened next? The answers to those questions often determine whether a case is solved or remains a mystery. In Pamela's case, investigators eventually concluded that after leaving the rehabilitation center, she traveled into the city of Macerata and headed toward the area around Diaz Park. According to the investigation, her purpose was to obtain heroin. This detail is both important and tragic. The reality of addiction is that relapse can occur even during treatment. People undergoing rehabilitation are not immune to cravings. Recovery programs exist precisely because addiction is difficult to overcome. A single decision made during a moment of vulnerability can have profound consequences. For Pamela, investigators believe that her search for heroin brought her into contact with a man named Innocent Osgale. The significance of this meeting cannot be overstated. At the time, it likely appeared to be a routine interaction within the context of the local drug trade. There is nothing to suggest that this encounter would soon become the central focus of one of Italy's most notorious criminal cases. The available information identifies Osgale as a Nigerian drug dealer who had previous convictions related to narcotics offenses. According to investigators, Pamela and Osgale met in the vicinity of Diaz Park on January 29th. What happened after that meeting would become the subject of years of investigation, prosecution, appeals, and public debate. Yet one fact quickly emerged. After encountering Osgale, Pamela disappeared. The simplicity of that statement conceals its enormous significance. Disappearances often begin quietly. There is rarely a dramatic announcement. No alarms sound. No public warning appears. Instead, a person simply stops appearing where they're expected to be. A phone call goes unanswered. A message receives no reply. Time passes. Concern grows. In many cases, the missing person eventually returns. In others, the silence becomes something far more ominous. For Pamela, the silence never ended. The hours following her disappearance would become some of the most important and most mysterious in the entire case. Investigators later attempted to reconstruct what occurred during this period. They examined physical evidence, forensic findings, and connections between the victim and the accused. Yet despite the extensive investigation that followed, the events themselves remained inaccessible except through the traces they left behind. This is one of the unsettling aspects of criminal investigations. By the time detectives arrive, the crime has already happened. The actions that matter most exist only in the past. Investigators are forced to work backward, assembling fragments of evidence in an effort to reconstruct reality. Every case becomes a puzzle. Every clue becomes a piece. Every contradiction becomes a challenge. And every missing detail creates uncertainty. For 2 days, Pamela's whereabouts remained unknown. Then came January 31st. Near Polenza, a small community located a few kilometers from Macerata, a discovery was made that would transform a missing person inquiry into a homicide investigation. 2 suitcases were found abandoned by the roadside. At first glance, the luggage may not have appeared remarkable. Suitcases are common objects. They accompany vacations, family visits, business trips, and countless ordinary journeys. But these suitcases were not part of an ordinary journey. Inside them were human remains. The victim was Pamela Mastropietro. The discovery shocked investigators and the public alike. Even in countries where violent crime occurs, cases involving dismemberment often provoke a particularly intense reaction. Such crimes suggest not only violence, but also deliberate efforts to conceal evidence and hinder identification. The method itself creates an additional layer of horror. For those arriving at the scene, the reality must have been difficult to process. An 18-year-old woman had vanished. Now parts of her body had been found inside luggage discarded near a roadside. The crime immediately attracted widespread attention. News organizations began reporting on the case. Public interest intensified. Questions multiplied. How had Pamela died? Who was responsible? What had happened during the missing hours between January 29th and January 31st? And why had her body been concealed in this way? At this stage of the investigation, authorities did not yet possess all the answers. What they had was a crime scene, a victim, and the beginning of a forensic process that would eventually uncover crucial evidence. The discovery of the suitcases marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Before January 31st, investigators were attempting to locate a missing young woman. After January 31st, they were investigating a murder. The distinction was profound. Missing person investigations focus on finding someone. Homicide investigations focus on determining how they died and who caused their death. Every resource available to investigators now shifted toward those objectives. The condition of the remains immediately indicated the seriousness of the crime. Public reaction was swift. Throughout Italy, people followed developments closely. The case contained many of the elements that tend to capture national attention: a young victim, a brutal crime, unanswered questions, and disturbing forensic details. Yet beyond the headlines existed a more fundamental tragedy. Pamela was only 18 years old. Whatever mistakes she may have made, whatever struggles she may have faced, she remained a young woman whose life had barely begun. Her story was no longer about recovery, no longer about treatment, no longer about future possibilities. Instead, it had become a homicide investigation. As authorities worked to identify evidence and establish a timeline, they gradually focused attention on the final known encounter investigators believed Pamela had before disappearing: the meeting with innocent Osgale. In retrospect, that encounter appears as a dividing line. Everything before it belongs to the life Pamela was still living. Everything after it belongs to the investigation into her death. Such dividing lines are common in criminal cases, though they are rarely visible at the time. People cross paths every day. Most encounters are insignificant. Some become memorable. A very small number alter lives forever. For Pamela Mastropietro, investigators would ultimately conclude that the encounter in Macerata on January 29th belonged to that final category. The evidence gathered in the days that followed would increasingly point investigators toward Osgale. Physical evidence, forensic findings, and links to locations associated with him would begin shaping the direction of the case. But at this stage, those discoveries had not yet been fully made. What existed instead was a growing realization that the crime was far more complex than anyone initially imagined. The discovery near Pollenza had answered one terrible question. What happened to the missing 18-year-old woman? Yet it raised many more. How exactly had she died? Where had the killing occurred? Why had the body been dismembered? Was the crime connected to drugs? Was there a sexual motive? Had anyone else been involved? Investigators now faced the difficult task of transforming questions into answers. The public, meanwhile, watched closely. Every update attracted attention. Every new piece of information generated speculation. Every delay increased frustration. People wanted certainty. They wanted accountability. They wanted an explanation for a crime that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The answers would not come immediately. They would emerge gradually through forensic examinations, evidence collection, witness statements, and courtroom proceedings that would stretch over several years. But the foundation of the entire case remained rooted in the events of January 29th and January 31st. An 18-year-old woman left a rehabilitation facility. She traveled to Macerata. She sought heroin near Diaz Park. She encountered a drug dealer named Innocent Osgale. She disappeared. 2 days later, her remains were discovered inside abandoned suitcases near Pollenza. Those are the facts that define the incident itself. Everything that follows, the investigation, the forensic findings, the legal battles, and a national controversy, begins with those events. And as investigators would soon discover, the evidence hidden within that timeline would eventually lead them toward a conclusion far different from the explanation initially offered by the accused. The search for those answers was only beginning. The discovery of Pamela Mastropietro's remains on January 31st, 2018, marked the beginning of a complex criminal investigation that would unfold over the following years. Up to that point, authorities were dealing with the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman. After the discovery near Pollenza, the situation changed completely. Investigators were no longer searching for a missing person. They were now tasked with solving a homicide that had already shocked the public because of its brutality. As with any major criminal investigation, detectives faced a difficult challenge from the outset. The crime itself had already occurred. The victim could no longer tell her story. The events leading to her death existed only in fragments scattered across physical evidence. Forensic findings, witness statements, and the actions of those connected to the case. The task before investigators was to reconstruct those missing hours and determine exactly what had happened. Every homicide investigation begins with a fundamental question. Who was the victim? In Pamela's case, authorities needed to formally identify the remains discovered inside the abandoned suitcases. Identification serves multiple purposes. It confirms the victim's identity, provides a starting point for reconstructing the timeline, and allows investigators to focus on the victim's final known movements. Once Pamela was identified, detectives were able to concentrate their efforts on the events of January 29th, the day she had left the rehabilitation center near Macerata. The timeline immediately became crucial. Investigators already knew that Pamela had departed the treatment facility without authorization. They also established that she had traveled to the area around Diaz Park in Macerata. According to the investigation, she had gone there seeking heroin. That fact naturally directed attention toward individuals involved in the local drug trade. As investigators traced Pamela's final known movements, one name emerged with increasing importance: Innocent Osgale. According to the available evidence, Osgale had encountered Pamela on January 29th. He was known to authorities as a drug dealer and had previous convictions related to narcotics offenses. The fact that he appeared in Pamela's final known timeline immediately elevated his significance within the investigation. However, investigators could not rely solely on chronology. Being the last known person connected to a victim does not automatically establish guilt. Criminal cases require evidence. Detectives, therefore, began gathering physical and forensic material capable of either confirming or disproving suspicions. The investigation soon produced several important findings. Among them were blood-stained articles of Pamela's clothing. In many homicide investigations, physical evidence forms the backbone of the prosecution's eventual case. Unlike witness memories, physical evidence does not forget details, become confused, or alter its account over time. Blood, DNA, fingerprints, fibers, and biological traces often provide investigators with their most reliable clues. The discovery of Pamela's blood-stained clothing represented an important development because it helped establish a connection between the victim and locations associated with the crime. Yet the clothing alone was not enough. Investigators continued searching for additional evidence capable of explaining what had happened during Pamela's final hours. Another significant element emerged through DNA analysis. DNA has transformed modern criminal investigations because it provides a powerful means of linking individuals, objects, and locations. In many cases, DNA evidence helps establish whether a victim was present at a particular site or whether contact occurred between specific individuals. In Pamela's case, investigators identified DNA evidence connected to the victim. This forensic material became part of a growing body of evidence that detectives used to reconstruct the events surrounding her death. As the investigation progressed, multiple pieces of evidence began pointing toward a specific location: Osgale's apartment. This development represented a major turning point. In criminal investigations, locations often become central because crimes rarely occur in isolation. Actions leave traces. Objects are moved. Biological material remains behind. Clothing, personal belongings, and other evidence may connect victims to places where important events occurred. The available information indicates that investigators discovered numerous evidentiary links leading toward Osgale's residence. The significance of this cannot be overstated. The apartment increasingly became a focal point of the investigation. The more evidence detectives gathered, the more attention they directed toward understanding what had happened there. At this stage, investigators had established several important facts. Pamela had left the rehabilitation center. She had traveled to Macerata. She had reportedly sought heroin near Diaz Park. She had encountered Osgale. She had disappeared. Her remains had later been discovered inside abandoned suitcases. Evidence connected the investigation to Osgale's apartment. Yet, one of the most important questions remained unanswered. How exactly had Pamela died? The answer to that question would become one of the most significant turning points in the entire case. As investigators continued gathering evidence, Osgale offered an explanation. According to his account, Pamela had died from a drug overdose. His position was not that he had murdered her. Instead, he claimed that she had suffered a fatal overdose and that his involvement centered on what happened afterward. From an investigative perspective, this distinction was critical. If Pamela had died from an overdose, the legal implications would be very different from those associated with intentional homicide. Determining the true cause of death, therefore, became one of the investigation's highest priorities. This is where forensic pathology assumed a central role. The autopsy would ultimately provide answers that neither public speculation nor suspect statements could establish on their own. Forensic examinations are among the most important tools available to homicide investigators because the human body often preserves evidence long after witnesses disappear and memories fade. Pathologists analyze injuries, determine causes of death, and evaluate whether explanations offered by suspects align with physical reality. In Pamela's case, the forensic findings would dramatically alter the direction of the investigation. The autopsy concluded that Pamela had not died from a heroin overdose. Instead, forensic experts determined that she died as a result of stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. This finding was enormously significant. The difference between an overdose and fatal stab wounds is not a matter of interpretation. It is a fundamentally different explanation for death. The autopsy directly contradicted the narrative that Pamela had simply succumbed to drug use. According to the forensic evidence, her death resulted from violence. For prosecutors, this discovery transformed the case. The investigation was no longer focused merely on the concealment of a body. It was now centered on a homicide supported by medical evidence. The autopsy became one of the strongest pillars of the prosecution's eventual case. When physical evidence contradicts a suspect's explanation, investigators naturally begin asking additional questions. If Pamela did not die from an overdose, why claim that she had? If the cause of death was stabbing, what happened during the encounter that led to those injuries? And if violence had occurred, what motivated the subsequent actions involving her remains? The answers prosecutors proposed would become another source of public shock. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, Pamela was attacked and killed. Afterward, her body was dismembered. The prosecution argued that this was done to conceal the crime. The dismemberment of a victim often introduces a particularly disturbing dimension to homicide cases because it suggests deliberate post-mortem actions designed to hinder identification, obstruct investigations, or dispose of evidence. For the public, these details intensify the horror already surrounding the case. For investigators, however, the focus remained practical. The key question was not simply what had happened, but why those actions had occurred and what evidence they revealed. The discovery of Pamela's remains inside suitcases strongly suggested efforts to transport and conceal the body. Prosecutors argued that these actions formed part of a broader attempt to cover up the killing. Yet, even here, the investigation encountered additional complications. Some portions of Pamela's remains were not fully recovered. This fact generated extensive public discussion and speculation. Cases involving incomplete recoveries often produce unanswered questions because certain details may remain impossible to establish with certainty. While investigators work to reconstruct events as accurately as possible, the absence of physical evidence can leave gaps that never disappear completely. The missing portions of Pamela's remains became one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the case. Media coverage amplified public curiosity. Speculation flourished. Rumors circulated. Yet investigators remained constrained by evidence rather than conjecture. Their responsibility was not to speculate, but to determine what could actually be proven. As the homicide investigation continued, another major issue emerged. Prosecutors alleged that the crime involved sexual violence. This allegation introduced an entirely new dimension to the case. Sexual violence allegations often require extensive forensic analysis, legal scrutiny, and careful evaluation because they carry significant consequences for both victims and defendants. In Pamela's case, prosecutors maintained that the homicide was connected to sexual assault. However, this aspect of the case would become one of the most contested elements of the legal proceedings. Unlike some portions of the investigation that were supported by relatively straightforward forensic findings, the sexual violence allegations generated years of legal disputes. Arguments continued through multiple levels of the Italian judicial system. Appeals challenged aspects of the evidence and legal interpretations. Courtrooms became the arena where these questions were debated. The controversy did not disappear quickly. Instead, it remained a significant issue long after the initial conviction. Years later, in 2023, the Court of Appeal in Perugia addressed the matter once again. The court ultimately confirmed Osgale's responsibility in relation to sexual violence connected to the crime. This decision represented an important legal milestone because it reaffirmed one of the prosecution's central assertions after years of litigation. By that point, the investigation had evolved into a much broader legal process involving appeals, reviews, and judicial scrutiny. Looking back, the investigation into Pamela Mastropietro's death can be understood as a gradual accumulation of evidence. No single clue solved the case. No dramatic confession suddenly explained everything. Instead, investigators built their understanding piece by piece. The timeline established Pamela's final known movements. Physical evidence connected her to critical locations. DNA evidence strengthened forensic links. The autopsy determined the true cause of death. Evidence led investigators toward Osgale's apartment. Prosecutors developed a theory explaining both the killing and the subsequent concealment of the body. At every stage, investigators were required to separate established fact from speculation. Public attention was intense. Media coverage was relentless. Political tensions would eventually surround the case. Yet the investigation itself depended upon evidence rather than emotion. By the time detectives completed their work, they believed they had assembled a compelling account of what had happened. The next phase would unfold not in crime scenes or forensic laboratories, but inside a courtroom. There, prosecutors and defense attorneys would present competing narratives before judges tasked with determining the truth. The outcome would shape not only the future of the accused, but also the public memory of one of Italy's most shocking criminal cases of the modern era. By the time the investigation into the death of Pamela Mastropietro reached the courtroom, the case had already become one of the most widely discussed criminal investigations in Italy. The discovery of an 18-year-old woman's dismembered remains inside abandoned suitcases had shocked the nation. The forensic findings had contradicted the central explanation initially offered by the accused. Evidence had gradually connected the victim's final movements to innocent Osgale. Public attention remained intense, and expectations surrounding the trial were enormous. Yet despite the media coverage and public outrage, the courtroom would ultimately focus on a much narrower question. Could prosecutors prove their case beyond doubt using admissible evidence? The legal system operates differently from public opinion. Outside the courtroom, people often form conclusions quickly. News reports, emotional reactions, and incomplete information can shape perceptions long before trial begins. Inside the courtroom, however, every allegation must be examined through evidence, testimony, forensic findings, and legal standards. The prosecution's task was straightforward in principle, even if complex in practice. They needed to demonstrate that Pamela's death was not the result of an accidental overdose, as claimed by Osgale, but rather a deliberate act of homicide. They needed to show that the evidence supported their reconstruction of events, and they needed to establish responsibility for the actions that followed Pamela's death, including the concealment and dismemberment of her remains. For the defense, the objective was equally clear. They sought to challenge aspects of the prosecution's narrative and raise doubts regarding the conclusions being presented to the court. As the trial began, prosecutors relied heavily on the evidence gathered during the investigation. One of the most important elements was the timeline. The court heard how Pamela had left the rehabilitation center near Macerata on January 29, 2018. Investigators had determined that she traveled into the city and sought heroin near Diaz Park. There, according to the investigation, she encountered innocent Osgale. This timeline was significant because it established the final known movements of the victim. In criminal cases, the last confirmed interactions often become critically important. They provide investigators and prosecutors with a framework through which later evidence can be interpreted. The prosecution argued that Pamela's encounter with Osgale represented the beginning of the sequence of events that ultimately led to her death. But timelines alone do not prove homicide. The prosecution, therefore, turned to physical evidence. Investigators had recovered blood-stained clothing connected to Pamela. They had gathered DNA evidence. They had identified various evidentiary links that directed attention toward Osgale's apartment. Taken individually, each piece of evidence provided only part of the picture. Taken together, prosecutors argued, they formed a coherent and compelling narrative. This concept is common in major criminal trials. Rarely does a single piece of evidence establish guilt entirely on its own. Instead, prosecutors seek to demonstrate how multiple independent pieces of evidence reinforce one another. The strength of the case comes not from any individual clue, but from the collective weight of the evidence as a whole. The prosecution's argument became even stronger when it addressed the cause of death. This issue sat at the center of the trial. Osgale's explanation rested on the claim that Pamela had died from a drug overdose. If that assertion had been supported by medical evidence, the legal landscape of the case would have looked very different. However, the forensic findings told another story. Medical experts concluded that Pamela had died from stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. This finding proved crucial. The autopsy effectively dismantled the overdose narrative. The distinction between a fatal overdose and fatal stab wounds is not a matter of interpretation. It is a medical determination. The forensic evidence established that Pamela's death resulted from violent injuries rather than accidental drug consumption. For prosecutors, this conclusion represented one of the strongest components of the entire case. The court now faced two competing versions of events. One version suggested that Pamela died accidentally from drug use. The other suggested that she was intentionally killed. The autopsy findings overwhelmingly supported the latter explanation. The prosecution then moved to another disturbing aspect of the case: the treatment of Pamela's body after her death. According to prosecutors, her remains were dismembered and concealed in an effort to hide the crime. The discovery of the remains inside abandoned suitcases near Pollenza became a central element of this argument. The prosecution maintained that these actions were not random. They argued that the concealment reflected deliberate efforts to prevent detection and obstruct investigators. Such allegations carried significant weight because they suggested consciousness of guilt. Courts often consider post-crime behavior important when evaluating criminal responsibility. Actions taken after a death may reveal attempts to evade detection, destroy evidence, or conceal involvement. In this case, prosecutors argued that the handling of Pamela's remains demonstrated exactly such an effort. The trial also addressed allegations concerning sexual violence. This aspect of the case would eventually become one of the most debated and legally contested elements of the proceedings. From the prosecution's perspective, The evidence supported the conclusion that the homicide was linked to sexual violence. The defense challenged aspects of those allegations. As often happens in serious criminal cases, legal arguments focused not only on factual questions, but also on how evidence should be interpreted under the law. These disputes would continue long after the initial verdict. Yet, during the trial itself, prosecutors presented the allegation as an integral component of their overall reconstruction of events. Throughout the proceedings, judges were tasked with evaluating all available evidence. Unlike television dramas, real criminal trials rarely revolve around dramatic surprises. More often, they involve the methodical examination of evidence accumulated over months or years of investigation. Documents are reviewed. Forensic findings are analyzed. Arguments are presented. Competing interpretations are compared. The process can be lengthy, technical, and sometimes frustratingly slow. But that careful scrutiny exists for a reason. The consequences of criminal convictions are profound. Courts must be confident that their decisions rest on evidence rather than speculation. As the proceedings continued, the prosecution maintained that the cumulative evidence established Osgale's responsibility for Pamela's death and the actions that followed. The defense attempted to challenge aspects of that narrative. Ultimately, however, the court reached a conclusion. In May 2019, innocent Osgale was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict represented a major milestone in the case. For Pamela's family, it marked the first major judicial acknowledgement of responsibility for her death. For prosecutors, it validated years of investigative work. For the public, it provided a measure of legal closure in a case that had generated enormous outrage. The convictions encompassed several serious offenses. These included intentional murder. They included sexual violence. They included the dismemberment of a body. They included the destruction and concealment of human remains. The life sentence reflected the gravity of those findings. In many criminal justice systems, life imprisonment is reserved for the most serious offenses. It represents the court's conclusion that the crime warrants the maximum available punishment. Yet major criminal cases rarely end with the initial verdict. The legal process continued. Appeals followed. This is a normal part of the judicial system. Appeals do not necessarily indicate flaws in a trial. Rather, they provide opportunities for higher courts to review legal decisions, examine disputed issues, and ensure that procedures were properly followed. In Pamela's case, appeals became particularly significant because several aspects of the prosecution's case remained subjects of legal debate. The issue of sexual violence, in particular, continued generating controversy during subsequent proceedings. Higher courts reviewed arguments presented by both sides. Judges examined evidence. Legal interpretations were scrutinized. The process stretched across multiple years. For families seeking closure, such prolonged litigation can be emotionally exhausting. A conviction may provide some measure of justice, but appeals often reopen painful memories and extend uncertainty. The legal system prioritizes accuracy and fairness. Yet those goals sometimes require lengthy proceedings. In this case, the appellate process became part of the broader story. Despite continued legal challenges, the core outcome remained unchanged. The conviction stood. The life sentence remained in place. One of the most significant developments occurred in 2023. That year, the Court of Appeal in Perugia confirmed Osgale's responsibility in relation to sexual violence connected to the crime. This ruling carried substantial importance because it reaffirmed one of the prosecution's major allegations after years of legal disputes. The decision strengthened the judicial conclusions that had emerged from the original proceedings. By this stage, the case had passed through multiple levels of review. Various courts had examined the evidence. Various judges had considered competing arguments, and the fundamental conclusions remained intact. The legal system had repeatedly revisited the case and repeatedly arrived at substantially the same outcome. As additional appeals concluded, the sentence remained effective. According to legal records referenced through 2025, Osgale's life sentence continued to stand. For the courts, this represented the final legal outcome. The case had traveled from investigation to trial, from conviction to appeal, and from public controversy to judicial resolution. Yet legal resolution is not the same thing as emotional closure. A verdict can determine responsibility. A sentence can impose punishment. An appeal can confirm legal findings. None of those actions, however, can restore what was lost. The courtroom can answer certain questions. Who is responsible? What crimes occurred? What punishment is appropriate? But other questions exist beyond the reach of judges and lawyers. What future might Pamela have had? What life might she have built if January 29, 2018, had unfolded differently? What opportunities disappeared alongside her? Those questions remain unanswered because they belong not to the legal system, but to the realm of possibility. The trial established criminal responsibility. The appeals confirmed it. The courts imposed punishment. Yet the deeper tragedy of the case remained unchanged. An 18-year-old woman who had been attempting to overcome addiction lost her life. The legal process could acknowledge that loss. It could punish those deemed responsible. It could establish a historical record of what the courts believed occurred. But it could never reverse the events themselves. By the time the final appeals were resolved, the judicial chapter of the Pamela Mastropietro case was largely complete. The investigation had produced answers. The courts had delivered judgments. The sentence had been upheld. However, the story was not over. Because long before the appeals concluded, the case had already begun producing consequences far beyond the courtroom. Its impact would spread into politics, public debate, media coverage, and even additional acts of violence. The aftermath of Pamela's death would prove almost as consequential as the criminal proceedings themselves. And it is in that aftermath that the final chapter of this story unfolds. When a criminal case reaches its legal conclusion, it is often assumed that the story has ended. A verdict is delivered, a sentence is imposed, and the justice system moves forward to other matters. Yet in reality, some cases do not remain confined to courtrooms. They spill outward into society, reshaping public discourse, influencing political debates, and leaving emotional and cultural traces that persist long after the final judgment. The murder of Pamela Mastropietro was one of those cases. Even after the conviction and life sentence of innocent Osgale, the impact of the crime continued to grow. In the days following the discovery of Pamela's remains near Pollenza, Italy experienced a wave of shock and outrage. The brutality of the crime, combined with the victim's age and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, created a powerful emotional response. News coverage spread rapidly across national media. The case was discussed not only as a criminal investigation, but as a reflection of broader social concerns already present in Italian public life. One of the most immediate effects of the case was the way it entered political discourse. The circumstances surrounding Pamela's death became intertwined with ongoing debates about immigration, drug trafficking, and public safety. Innocent Osgale's status as a Nigerian national was frequently referenced in public discussions, and the case was quickly absorbed into wider conversations about migration policy and social integration in Italy. However, these discussions often extended beyond the specific facts of the case itself. Different groups interpreted the tragedy in different ways. Some focused on drug addiction and the vulnerabilities faced by individuals in recovery systems. Others emphasized issues related to crime and law enforcement. Still others framed the case within broader political arguments about immigration and national security. As a result, Pamela's story began to exist on two levels at once. On one level, it remained a criminal case involving a specific victim, a specific suspect, and a specific sequence of events established through investigation and trial. On another level, it became a symbol within larger cultural and political debates. This dual existence is common in high-profile criminal cases, but can also complicate public understanding. When a case becomes symbolic, it risks being interpreted through ideological lenses rather than factual ones. While public debate intensified, another event added further tension to the aftermath. Shortly after Pamela's body was discovered, a violent incident occurred in Macerata involving Luca Traini, a man associated with far-right ideology. He carried out a shooting targeting individuals of African origin in the city, injuring several people. He later stated that his actions were motivated by a desire to avenge Pamela's death. This event significantly escalated national attention on the case. What had begun as a homicide investigation was now connected, in public perception, to a separate act of violence. The shooting introduced urgent questions about the relationship between crime, rhetoric, and retaliatory violence. It also intensified debates about how media coverage and political commentary might influence public emotions during sensitive criminal cases. Authorities and commentators were forced to confront a difficult reality. A single criminal case, already tragic in itself, had become associated with further violence. The consequences extended beyond the original crime scene, demonstrating how narratives surrounding high-profile cases can sometimes produce unpredictable and far-reaching effects. At the center of all of this remained Pamela Mastropietro. It is important to return to that point, because in the wider noise of political debate and media coverage, the identity of the victim can become overshadowed by the discussions surrounding the case. Pamela was 18 years old. She was a young woman who had been struggling with drug addiction and participating in rehabilitation efforts near Macerata. Like many individuals facing substance dependency, her life included moments of instability, treatment, and attempted recovery. She was not defined solely by those struggles, but those struggles were part of her lived experience. Her final known movements involved leaving a rehabilitation facility on January 29, 2018. She traveled into Macerata. She encountered Innocent Osgale, a drug dealer with prior convictions related to narcotics. She disappeared. 2 days later, her remains were discovered inside suitcases abandoned near Pollenza. These are the facts that remain at the core of the case. Everything else, the investigation, the trial, the appeals, and the public debate builds upon those events. The legal system ultimately concluded that Osgale was responsible for her murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. That outcome provided a formal resolution within the justice system. It established accountability in legal terms and concluded years of courtroom proceedings. But legal resolution does not erase the emotional and social impact of a crime. For Pamela's family and loved ones, the loss is permanent. No verdict can restore what was taken. No sentence can return what was lost. The passage of time may bring some degree of acceptance, but it does not undo the absence. In many true crime cases, there is a temptation to focus on the procedural aspects of justice, the investigation, the evidence, the trial, the conviction. These elements are important because they demonstrate how societies respond to violence and attempt to uphold accountability. However, behind every case file is a human story. Pamela's story is not only about how she died, but also about the vulnerability that preceded her final hours. It includes her efforts toward recovery, her time in rehabilitation, and her struggle with addiction. These elements do not explain or justify the crime committed against her, but they provide context for understanding the circumstances in which she lived. Her death also highlights broader systemic issues that extend beyond a single individual case. Drug addiction continues to affect countless people across Europe and the world. Rehabilitation systems strive to support recovery, but relapse remains a persistent challenge. Individuals navigating addiction often face environments where vulnerability can intersect with exploitation and danger. Pamela's case reflects these realities without being reducible to them. At the same time, the public reaction to her death illustrates how quickly complex tragedies can become part of larger narratives. When a crime becomes highly visible, it can be interpreted through multiple lenses simultaneously: legal, social, political, and emotional. Each perspective may highlight different aspects of the story, but none of them can fully capture the entirety of what occurred. Over time, as legal proceedings concluded and media attention gradually shifted to other events, the immediate intensity surrounding the case diminished. However, the case itself remained part of Italy's recent criminal history, referenced in discussions of forensic investigation, criminal law, and social policy. By 2025, the legal outcome remained unchanged. Innocent Özgeal's life sentence stood as the final judicial determination in the case. Yet even with the legal chapter closed, the story continues to carry weight. Not because of ongoing investigation, but because of what it represents. It represents the fragility of life during moments of vulnerability. It represents the intersection of addiction, crime, and exploitation. It represents the capacity of a single event to ripple outward into society in unexpected ways. And most importantly, it represents an individual life that ended far too soon. Pamela Mastropietro was not a symbol when her life began. She became one only after her death, as society attempted to make sense of what had happened. But beneath every interpretation, every headline, and every debate, there remains a simple and irreversible fact. An 18-year-old woman left a rehabilitation center in Macerata in January 2018. She did not return, and the consequences of that absence continue to echo in memory, in law, and in public consciousness. The story ends here not because it has been fully understood, but because there is nothing further that can change its outcome. Only the task of remembering remains. When a criminal case reaches its final legal resolution, society often behaves as though the story has reached a natural conclusion, as if the verdict has sealed the narrative into something complete and self-contained. But the reality of cases like the death of Pamela Mastropietro is that the legal ending is only a procedural endpoint, not an emotional or social one. Because even after the courts have spoken and the appeals have been exhausted, the case continues to exist in memory, in public discourse, and in the way people interpret violence, vulnerability, and justice itself. In the years following the investigation and trial, Pamela's name did not disappear from public consciousness in Italy, partly because the brutality of the crime made it difficult to forget, and partly because the case had already become embedded in broader debates that extended far beyond the facts of a single homicide. And this is one of the defining characteristics of modern high-profile crimes, where the event itself becomes layered with meaning, interpretation, and symbolic weight that can sometimes overshadow the human being at the center of it. Yet behind all of that complexity, the core facts remain fixed and unchanged. An 18-year-old woman left a rehabilitation facility near Macerata on January 29, 2018. She traveled into the city where she was later believed to have encountered innocent Özgeal. She disappeared shortly afterward, and 2 days later her remains were discovered inside suitcases abandoned near Pollenza, a sequence of events that was later examined through forensic analysis, legal proceedings, and judicial review that ultimately resulted in a life sentence for Osgale, with courts confirming over time the central findings of murder and related crimes, including later appellate affirmation in 2023 regarding sexual violence elements as recorded in the judicial process. But even as these legal determinations solidified responsibility in the eyes of the law, they did not resolve the broader tensions the case had already activated in society. One of the most significant aspects of the aftermath was how quickly the case became part of national conversations about immigration, drug policy, and public safety, with public debate frequently extending beyond the evidentiary record and into ideological interpretation, something that is not unique to this case, but is particularly pronounced in cases involving violent crime and identifiable social categories, where different groups selectively emphasize different aspects of the same events, some focusing on the vulnerability of addiction and the failures of support systems, others on criminality and enforcement, and others still on migration and social integration, creating a fragmented narrative landscape where the same set of facts can be used to support competing conclusions. In parallel, the case also highlighted the role of media amplification in shaping public perception, because once the discovery of the suitcases became national news, the story developed a momentum of its own, with each new procedural update, forensic detail, or courtroom development reinforcing public attention and emotional response. And this cycle is familiar in many modern criminal cases, where the boundary between reporting and narrative interpretation can blur, especially when the facts themselves are already emotionally charged. At the same time, it is important to recognize that behind every layer of interpretation, there remains the individual whose life was lost. And Pamela's case is often discussed in terms of systems, institutions, and societal reactions. But the human reality is simpler and more irreducible than any of those frameworks, because she was not a symbol at the moment she left the rehabilitation center. She was a young woman engaged in a difficult struggle with addiction, navigating an unstable period of her life. And like many people in similar circumstances, she existed within a system that is designed to support recovery, but cannot guarantee it. And the tragedy of her story lies not in abstraction, but in the abrupt and irreversible interruption of a life that was still in progress. The investigation itself, when viewed in isolation, represents a relatively structured process of modern forensic policing, beginning with the identification of remains, moving through timeline reconstruction, evidence collection, DNA analysis, and autopsy findings that establish cause of death as stab wounds rather than overdose, and culminating in the linkage of physical evidence and locations associated with the suspect, forming the basis for prosecution. And this procedural clarity stands in contrast to the emotional ambiguity that surrounds the case in public memory. Because while the legal system requires precision and proof, public discourse often gravitates toward meaning and interpretation, which can lead to simplification or amplification depending on the perspective being adopted. The trial and subsequent appeals demonstrated another important aspect of modern justice systems, namely that legal truth is not delivered in a single moment, but constructed over time through layered review, where initial convictions may be reaffirmed or refined through appellate scrutiny. And in this case, the life sentence imposed in 2019 and upheld through subsequent judicial processes represented the system's final determination of criminal responsibility. Yet even that finality exists only within the boundaries of law, not within the broader human impact of the crime. In reflecting on the aftermath, it becomes clear that cases like this leave behind multiple forms of residue. First, the legal record, which establishes facts, responsibility, and punishment. Second, the public narrative, which interprets those facts through cultural and political frameworks. And third, the personal absence, which remains unchanged regardless of any external resolution. And it is this last element that persists most quietly but most powerfully. Because for the family and those who knew Pamela, the passage of time does not transform the fundamental reality of loss. Another dimension of the aftermath lies in how society processes violence involving young victims with histories of addiction, because such cases often trigger uncomfortable conversations about vulnerability, risk, and social responsibility, raising questions that do not have simple answers about how systems of care interact with individuals in crisis, and how moments of relapse or instability can intersect with external dangers in ways that produce irreversible outcomes. However, it is also important to avoid reducing Pamela's identity to her addiction, because doing so risks repeating a broader pattern often seen in public discourse around crime victims with complex personal histories, where one aspect of their life becomes disproportionately emphasized at the expense of their full humanity. And in this case, the essential truth is that she was a young person whose life contained both struggle and possibility, and whose death occurred in circumstances that were later legally defined as homicide. As time passes, high-profile cases tend to settle into a kind of historical position where immediate emotional intensity fades, but institutional memory remains. And Pamela's case now exists in that space, referenced in legal discussions, media retrospectives, and broader analyses of crime and society in Italy, but no longer unfolding in real time through daily headlines or courtroom updates. Yet, even as attention shifts elsewhere, the underlying questions raised by the case remain relevant. Not because the specific details will change, but because the structural issues it touches upon continue to exist, including addiction treatment systems, the risks faced by vulnerable individuals, and the ways in which societies respond to violent crime when it intersects with politically sensitive topics. Ultimately, the case of Pamela Mastropietro cannot be understood solely as a sequence of investigative steps or judicial outcomes, nor solely as a political flashpoint, because it is all of those things simultaneously while also being something simpler and more permanent. The record of a life that ended abruptly and the attempt of a society to make sense of that ending through law, narrative, and collective memory. And while the legal system can determine guilt and impose punishment, it cannot fully resolve the deeper human impact of what happened, which remains in the space between facts and meaning, where questions about vulnerability, responsibility, and loss continue to linger long after the final page of the case has been written.